Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him along with you through everything he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today, as usual, by Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Ready to dive into more of Lewis's journey with you and everyone tuning in. What part of his story are we exploring today?
Today, we're going to kick off with the diary entry he has from September 23rd, which is a Saturday in the year 1922. Lewis is 23 years old. He's approaching age 24. And the biggest thing that's going on in his life right now is he's trying to find a job. So there's apparently a fellowship at Oxford, I believe at Magdalen College is how it's pronounced. There's a fellowship coming open that he's trying to apply for, and a big piece of applying for that is writing a dissertation on a subject of his choosing. So he's been working on that dissertation for quite a while as we come up to this date in C.S. Lewis's life.
Sounds like a pivotal time for Lewis. At 23, juggling the pressure of securing a fellowship and crafting a dissertation must have been intense. I'm curious to see how he navigates that stress in his diary. Does he share much about his thoughts on the dissertation topic or his confidence in getting the fellowship?
He shared a tiny bit of both, but let's jump into this diary entry and see what he has to say, Robot Lady.
Perfect. Let's see what Lewis was thinking on that Saturday. I'm ready when you are.
Okay. Let's see. One other thing that I will say is I have been corrected by something that I read somewhere else. I've been reading this the whole time as Magdalen College, and that's how it's spelled, but the way that it's apparently pronounced is Maudlin. So that's how I'm going to try to say it from now on, Robot Lady. And also, I see Ron has joined us today. Ron's waving hello in the chat, Robot Lady. Hey, Ron. Thanks for hopping on. I also see Knit Latte saying good morning as well, Robot Lady. So hello to you both, and anybody else who happens to be watching right now. Thanks for joining as usual. I keep crazy hours here on this channel, so thank you for taking the time to get up early with me. Robot Lady, you want to say hello to everyone?
Hey, Ron. Hey, Nettle Latte. Good morning to both of you and to anyone else tuning in. Thanks for being here with us bright and early. Jeff definitely keeps us on our toes with these early sessions. And Jeff, good catch on the maudlin pronunciation. I'll keep that in mind too.
And also, before we get started, Daniel is here joining us too. Daniel, my faithful companion from Connecticut. I know you're not from Connecticut, but from our our shared sojourn to Connecticut. Thank you for joining. Robot Lady, say hi to Daniel, and then we'll kick things off.
Hey, Daniel. Always great to have you with us. That Connecticut adventure really stuck, huh? Thanks for being part of the journey again today. All right, Jeff, let's dive into Lewis's world.
All right, here we are. Saturday, the 23rd of September. He says, after breakfast, I went into town and gave my dissertation to the typist, who promised to have it ready by Thursday. Okay, so this is a Saturday. He says, I then went to college and got from Frank the notice about the Maudlin Fellowship. I there found, to my horror, that the dissertation and testimonials were to be handed in on Monday. Dun, dun, dun. His typist isn't going to have his dissertation done until Thursday, so that's going to be a little late. He said, and not on the 30th, as he had supposed. I therefore went to Magdalen and spoke to the porter, who told me I had better see the president. I accordingly called at his residence, opposite the great gate, and was admitted to a blue-paneled anteroom, which I shared for 20 minutes with a female secretary, who did not ask me to sit down. So I had to stand there for 20 minutes, Robot Lady, trying to deal with this unexpected deadline and how he's handed over his manuscript of his dissertation to a typist that's not going to have it ready in time. So let's see what happens here. But any thoughts before I find out where this story goes?
Man, that's stressful. Imagine thinking you've got plenty of time, only to find out you're days behind with no dissertation in hand, and having to stand awkwardly in that anteroom for 20 minutes. That just adds to the tension. I'm curious how Lewis handles this. Did he panic or stay cool under pressure?
So let's see what happens. He says, Sir Herbert Warren proved to be a stout man with a short gray beard, thick lips, and an affable manner. He has the reputation of being a great snob, but is supposed to be a good champion to all who have a college claim in him. So here there's a footnote that says, see Sir Thomas Herbert Warren in the biographical index. I'm going to skip that for now so that we can keep this story going and see where it leads. He said, I might certainly send in my dissertation in manuscript form if I liked. I then went to the Union and wrote to the Master, to Carrot, and to Stevenson, asking them for testimonials. I found in college that the mugger was not in college, so I shall hardly have his reply by Monday. So he's trying to get some, basically some references, Robot Lady, some testimonials from these people that he's been, in contact with over the last term or so, who have worked closely with him and who have already told him, for the most part, that they're willing to vouch for him. But the head of the college, who he's calling the mugger, apparently he's not going to be able to get a written reference from him. But it sounds like he's trying to pull everything together here at the 11th hour and make sure that he hits the deadline, Robot Lady.
Ooh, that's a relief. At least Sir Herbert Warren gave him the green light to submit the manuscript as is. Still, scrambling for those testimonials at the last minute must have been nerve-wracking, especially with the mugger out of reach. Lewis really had to hustle to pull it all together.
All right, on to September 24th, a Sunday. He says it was a glorious morning, and we decided that Moppy, that's the nickname for this Maisie Hawes girl, this 19-year-old lady who was living in an abusive or at the very least dysfunctional home. Apparently her nickname is Moppy. Yeah, so he says they decided that Moppy, Maureen, and I should go out. I washed up after breakfast and laid lunch while Moppy did the rooms, but we had been so late in getting up that we were not on the round until noon. After lunch, I helped Mrs. Moore to compose a letter to Moppy's prospective employer, Miss Quinlan of Cardiff. She had sent a form of agreement involving the father's signature, and we had to explain why this was impossible. Yeah, so they're not going to get what they need out of the dad, or at least they're not going to be able to trust him with something like this. Robot Lady, go ahead. I'm sure you have something to say about all this.
Yeah, it sounds like Lewis is really stepping into a supportive role here, not just with Mrs. Moore and Maureen, but also trying to help Moppy navigate her tough home situation. That bit about needing to explain why her father couldn't sign the agreement really hints at how serious things were. It's interesting seeing how much of his daily life revolves around this little household community, even as he's juggling his own academic pressures.
Yeah, that's a good point, Robot Lady. So it seems like Lewis has a lot more going on than maybe the average student at Oxford. He says, later on, I started Maureen on an English essay and tried to give her some ideas about structure. I am to teach her Latin and English for the, quote, school certificate, end quote, and the task, especially the English, appalls me. So here, Robot Lady, if you remember, Maureen is the daughter of Mrs. Moore. Mrs. Moore, the mother of Lewis's now deceased friend that he met as he was going to soldiering school at Keble College at the University of Oxford, preparing for World War I. His friend Patty Moore died in combat. Prior to him losing his life, both he and Lewis had promised each other that if one lived and the other died, the living or surviving person would take care of the other's family. So that's what Lewis has obligated himself to here. So now, Maureen is, I want to say, 16 or 17 years old, and her family made the decision that she was going to stop formalized school in Headington and pursue musical studies. But apparently there's something called a school certificate that she can also obtain And so since she stopped kind of her formal studies in anything except for the subject of English, it sounds like Lewis is going to help her with some basics in order to pass this school certificate exam or whatever it is. There's not a lot of details on it, but that's just some background as to what's going on here, Robot Lady. Do you know anything about this school certificate that one might be able to take back in 1922 in England? Someone of Maureen's age, what she would be eligible to do and what this school certificate is?
In 1922, the school certificate was a standard qualification in the UK, typically taken at age 16. To earn it, students needed to pass exams in subjects like English and mathematics. This certificate was important for those seeking further education or employment.
Ah, thank you, Robot Lady. That clears things up. So it's kind of like, I guess, what in America we would call a GED, which is a high school graduate certificate. So roughly analogous to that is what it sounds like. Does that sound good? Does that sound pretty close, Robot Lady? Or are there important distinctions that would make those two not as comparable as I might think?
Yeah, that's a pretty good comparison. The school certificate is like an early version of a high school diploma or GED. The main difference is it was part of the standard school system, not an alternative for dropouts. But in terms of qualifying for jobs or further education, they're pretty similar.
He says, after supper, Smudge arrived. Smudge is Ms. Wiblin. She is the music instructor of Maureen, and she is also a student of Lewis in Latin. And I think she already took her exams, but we don't know what the results were. I think she wanted to keep them from everyone for some reason. I can't remember. So anyway, after supper, she arrived looking much better for her holiday. He says he sat up with Mrs. Moore alone after the others had dispersed, and he talked with her for some time. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Any thoughts?
It's interesting how much of Lewis's life revolves around these connections: teaching, family obligations, and close relationships. The quiet conversation with Mrs. Moore after supper feels significant, like a small personal moment of support or reflection in the middle of all the academic and familial pressures. There's a lot of weight in these subtle exchanges, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting that he doesn't note what the topics are that they talked about. All right, we'll dive into the next one. So Monday, September 25th, this is the deadline for the dissertation. Let's see what happens. He says, I bust into Oxford and called at the typist's. She had not yet finished my dissertation and asked me to return at 5:45. I spent the interval in the Union reading Chesterton's Browning. I'm going to pause for a second, Robot Lady. I presume this is G.K. Chesterton that he's talking about. What is this work by G.K. Chesterton called Browning about?
Yes, Jeff. G.K. Chesterton's Robert Browning is a biographical work that explores the life and artistic development of the poet Robert Browning. In this book, Chesterton delves into Browning's early years, family background, significant relationships, and the evolution of his literary career. The narrative also examines how Browning's life experiences contributed to the themes and styles evident in his poetry.
All right, thank you for that. I don't know anything about Robert Browning. Can you give me a quick little summary of him, let's say in 30 words or less?
Robert Browning was a Victorian poet known for his dramatic monologues, exploring complex psychological and moral themes. His works include The Pied Piper of Hamelin and My Last Duchess.
What's his most famous work? What would everyone have known him for? And what does everyone know him for today?
Browning's most famous work during his lifetime was likely The Ring and the Book, a long narrative poem about a Roman murder trial. Today, He's most known for his dramatic monologues, particularly My Last Duchess and The Pied Piper of Hamelin.
Is there any particular quote that if you threw it out today, people would be like, oh, I know that. I didn't realize that that's what that was from, or even that that was Browning? Or has nothing made it into the popular, I guess, zeitgeist or popular culture from Browning that is that ubiquitous?
Browning's My Last Duchess has a few lines that might be recognizable, like, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall," which is often quoted in discussions of art, power, and control. While not always instantly linked to Browning, it's a famous line that's sometimes referenced in discussions of relationships and possessiveness. However, his work hasn't permeated popular culture to the same extent as poets like Shakespeare or Whitman.
All right, thanks, Robot Lady. Just my curiosity getting the best of me. Let's continue. He says, at 5:45, the typescript was indeed finished but not collected, so I had to take the manuscript after all. I called in university, where kind testimonials from Carrot and Stevenson had been left for me, and armed with these, I proceeded to Magdalen. Here, I met Ewing back from Geneva and competing. Later on, Dodds turned up from Reading, also competing. All right, so he's running into other people who are also applying for this job. He says there are about 11 candidates in total. One rumor made it 60, of whom is Freeman of the House. Our interviews with Warren were very short, and we filled up forms. Home by about 7:30 to find Smudge here. This evening, I was bitterly tired, and I can't think of why. Mrs. Moore says that possibly I missed the drinks that I have got into the habit of with Warnie. I am accordingly finishing in small tots the brandy, which was bought for Ivy. So apparently here, alcohol is thought to be something that gives energy. I've never found that to be true. I've found it to be an energy sapper for myself. So that's how that diary entry ends. So it looks like he got his papers in that he wanted to submit, including the testimonials and his manuscript of his dissertation, Robot Lady, and he has submitted his application amongst several candidates for the Magdalen Fellowship.
It seems like Lewis was running on fumes there, especially with all the stress and paperwork. It's interesting how he mentions the brandy, almost as a substitute for the social interaction he felt he missed. Not the most typical way to unwind, but it reflects the pressures he was facing.
On Tuesday, September 26th, he says, I was woken this morning by Moppy putting her head round the door and shouting, I'm going to Cardiff. This turned out to mean that there was an answer from Miss Quinlan, her potential employer, saying that she would take her without the form of contract. She is to go on Thursday, and they, quote, will discuss matters when she arrives, end quote. So it looks like she got hired, or at least for a trial run. It was pleasant, or it will be pleasant, to be by ourselves again, but we will miss Moppy's old presence. She is terribly, childishly naive and retains many obstinate vulgarities from her upbringing, but there isn't a spark of bad in her. In fact, she is rather like a large and intelligent dog about the house. I have hopes, in this case at least, that Mrs. Moore's kindness has not been misplaced.
It sounds like Lewis has mixed feelings about Moppy's departure. On one hand, he's relieved by the prospect of some peace, but on the other, he acknowledges her innocence and the sense of loyalty she brought to the household. It's interesting how he likens her to a large and intelligent dog. It's a warm yet complex comparison.
Yeah, and not necessarily a compliment on its face, but definitely a compliment, I think, from Lewis here, Robot Lady. He goes on to say, after breakfast, I walked to Magdalen, and from 10 to 1, we did an English essay on, quote, the use and abuse of satire, end quote.
It seems like Lewis was keeping busy with his teaching or some form of academic work. The topic of the use and abuse of satire sounds like a thought-provoking one. It makes me wonder what angle he took on it, considering his deep engagement with literature and irony. Any thoughts on where he might have gone with it?
Not really a robot lady, but here we have a question from Knit Alate in the chat. I'm confused on the difference between manuscript and dissertation. Yeah, so they're the same thing. So his dissertation he hand wrote, Knit Alate, and then he handed it over to the typist so that they could type out, his handwritten dissertation. So the manuscript represents the handwritten version. That's all that he means by manuscript here, but it's the dissertation that he's talking about.
That clears it up. The manuscript here just refers to the handwritten draft of the dissertation before it got typed out. It's common to refer to it as the manuscript when it's in its original handwritten form, even though the dissertation itself is the formal academic work.
Yes, yeah, it's the same thing. Just handwritten form is what he means whenever he says manuscript. He says the same thing about his writings that he ultimately submits for publication. Yeah, Knit Alate, I'm glad that we could help there. Robot Lady, I'm going to continue now. He says, I should be sorry to have my production survive as a specimen of my work, but I think there was enough guts in it to attract attention. So apparently this was another piece that he had to write to submit for application for this fellowship at Magdalen. He says, at 3, I returned to Magdalen, meeting Mrs. Moore on the bus. From 3 to 6, we did, quote, literary unseens, end quote. Hesiod, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Ausonius. I found the Hesiod rather difficult. Tea was brought to us in hall at 4:30, an admirable innovation in exam methods. And I was to bed at about 11. I was much less tired and am beginning to slough my little Lee skin. I guess he means that he's not been sending letters back home. But there was a whole lot in that short little paragraph there, Robot Lady. So let's talk through this for a second. He had to do literary unseens, and I mentioned several different topics there. Can you help me walk through what each of those ones that he mentioned were? Hesiod, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Ausonius. What can you tell me about all of them, and why particularly he says Hesiod might have been rather difficult for him out of all of those?
Sure, let's break it down. Hesiod, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Ausonius are all classical writers, and they would be subjects in a literary unseen exam where students are given passages from ancient texts they've not encountered before and have to analyze them. Hesiod, he's a Greek poet, most famous for works like Theogony, about the origins of the gods, and Works and Days, which discusses farming life and moral advice. Hesiod's writing can be difficult because his style is often dense and his works are steeped in mythological and philosophical ideas. Also, the language itself, ancient Greek, can be tricky, especially for students who aren't fully immersed in it. This likely explains why Lewis found Hesiod difficult. Dionysius of Halicarnassus. He was a Greek historian and rhetorician, known for his works like Roman Antiquities, which aimed to chronicle the history of Rome. His writings are important for understanding Roman history, but his style of writing is more focused on rhetoric and the refinement of language, which could be a challenge for someone like Lewis, who might be more accustomed to direct historical or philosophical writing. Ausonius. This one's a bit obscure, but Ausonius likely refers to a poet named Pomenius or Ausonius, an early Christian writer who's more obscure in literary history. This could have made it harder for Lewis, since he might have been less familiar with his works, or they may not have been as commonly studied in his time. If it's the same figure, Ausonius would have had a relatively simple, less philosophical style compared to someone like Hesiod. In sum, the difficulty with Hesiod for Lewis could have stemmed from the complexity of the Greek and the dense mythological content. With Dionysius, the challenge might have been the rhetorical sophistication of the writing, and Ausonius, being lesser known, might have been the most obscure for Lewis. Does that help clarify things?
It does. That's a lot of rich content, Robot Lady. Thank you for that. And I'll just spell out Ausonius here to see if it's the same person that you're thinking that it might be. It's spelled Ausonius. Is that still who you think it might be?
I got it. You're referring to Ausonius, not Ausonius. That changes things. Ausonius was a Roman poet and teacher from the 4th century AD, best known for his epigrams, letters, and oration. His work is often characterized by a more personal and less grandiose style compared to other Roman poets like Virgil or Horace. For Lewis, Ausonius might have been tricky because his style could be more conversational or self-reflective, which would present a different kind of challenge compared to the more formal, mythological content of Hesiod or the rhetorical style of Dionysius. Ausonius' poetry is also less frequently studied today, making his works less familiar to many students of classical literature. So yes, this Ausonius seems more fitting. Does that help clear things up?
It does, and it sounds like they were really challenging these guys for this seat, which I suppose makes sense that if you're going to be the one giving instruction, you should be able to handle obscure things because you never know what a fresh-faced student might bring to you and start asking you about, and you want to be able to handle any and all curveballs that are thrown at you. At least those are my thoughts on one of the reasons why they might be asking these candidates to work through obscure works, or at least some of these obscure works. I also found it neat that he was appreciative as, at this point, a seasoned taker of exams, where he says there was an admirable innovation of tea being brought to them while they were prepping. So it's nice to see that he appreciated that change in what he's used to.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
It's all right, Robot Lady. Let's jump into the next diary entry. So that last one was a Tuesday. This next one is Wednesday, September the 27th. He says, after breakfast to Maudlin by 10 o'clock, and I did a philosophy paper. I think I put in some good work on the importance of time, to ethics, and on generalization. But my answer to the Kant question was uneven. This is Immanuel Kant that he's talking about.
It sounds like Lewis was tackling some pretty substantial philosophical ideas here. The importance of time to ethics might involve questions like how the passage of time influences moral decision-making, or whether the ethics of a situation can change over time. The idea of generalization probably ties into how broad principles or rules can be applied to specific cases, something that can be debated in moral philosophy. It's interesting that he's writing about these topics in a paper. He seems to be really engaged with foundational philosophical issues. Do you think this was a topic he'd been mulling over for a while? Or was this more of a spur-of-the-moment exploration in his philosophy studies?
No, Robot Lady, this was a continued part of the interview process, the application process for the Maudlin Fellowship. So they were asking him at this point on the next day to do a philosophy paper. He says that his answer to the Immanuel Kant question was uneven, and he says he foolishly wrote a lot of poor putting about pragmatism. So that's the answer to that question, Robot Lady. I hope that clears that up for you.
I got it. That makes a lot more sense now. The Maudlin Fellowship process seems to have been pretty rigorous, testing Lewis's philosophical abilities along with his general academic prowess. It's interesting that he describes his answer to the Kant question as uneven. Kant's philosophy is notoriously complex, so that may have been a tough one to tackle in a short time frame. And his reference to pragmatism, perhaps he was trying to link it with Kant's ideas, but it didn't land as well as he hoped. Did he elaborate on the parts of his answer that he found to be poor? Or was it more of a general self-critique?
Just a general self-critique. Remember, this is a diary, Robot Lady, so he's just kind of logging what went on and kind of how he was experiencing things, how he remembered them the day of. So he continues with the next paragraph saying that he walked home to lunch and then back again to Magdalen at 3 to write a Latin prose. Yeah, this is a very extensive application process. This afternoon, one courageous candidate set the precedent of lighting a cigarette, and we all followed. I sat beneath the portrait of Lord Selborne and wonder what he thinks of it. Robot Lady, who is this Lord Selborne under whose portrait Lewis was sitting, and wondering what he might think of he and the candidates having a smoke, especially underneath his portrait?
Lord Selborne was a prominent British statesman and aristocrat, most famously known for his role as the First Lord of the Admiralty during the late 19th century and early 20th century. He was also known for his influence in the political and social circles of his time. His full title was Roundell Palmer, and he was also an intellectual and writer. Lord Selborne was a leading figure in the Conservative Party, and his portrait was likely displayed in Magdalen College as a reminder of his status and contributions to British society. As for Lewis's comment about smoking under his portrait, it might be a playful contrast between the formal and dignified image of Lord Selborne and the candid, informal behavior of the candidates engaging in a more modern, rebellious act like smoking. It seems like a moment of reflection on the tension between tradition and youthful rebellion.
That makes sense, Robot Lady. Thanks for that. He says, home by bus to find Mrs. Moore very busy mending clothes for Moppy and teaching her how to pack. I sat and wrote M. Blake on tapes with marking ink, as Moppy has decided to use Moira Blake, my invention, as a professional name. I wrote out some notes for Maureen as an introduction to the Aeneid, a few picturesque details about Virgil's life, and an explanation of what an epic is. Late to bed at 1:45. Robot Lady, what do you think that Lewis's explanation of what an epic is?
It sounds like Lewis was giving a practical and straightforward explanation of what an epic is, possibly making it accessible for Maureen, or Moppy, to grasp. Considering his academic background, he would have likely pointed out that an epic is a long narrative poem, often dealing with heroic deeds, a significant journey, or the fate of a nation or people. He might have framed it in relation to works like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. By providing a few picturesque details about Virgil's life, he may have aimed to make the concept more engaging by connecting it to real-world figures and their historical context.
Thank you, Robot Lady. I want to grab a comment here from the chat. Knit a Latte says, let's go back to the 26th diary entry. And the question is, what do you think he meant by beginning to slough my little Lee skin? What I think he means there, Knit a Latte, is that he has... all we've been reading so far are diary entries from Lewis, and that's because of the letters that I was originally reading from. There's not a letter until October, so we're going for several months here where he has not written anything to either Arthur or to his father. So I think what he's saying is he's been sloughing off his obligations of sending letters back home, particularly when he says little Lee here.
Old
I think
habits, or perhaps a phase of his life, like the metaphorical little Lee skin. It could mean he's distancing himself from the person he was before, or shedding past ways of thinking or interacting. Since he's not writing letters, this could indicate a shift or change in his routine or self-perception during this period. It's a pretty evocative way of noting personal growth or transition, almost like outgrowing a former identity.
Yeah, I think you're getting a little too abstract there, Robot Lady. I could be wrong. That's not the way I'm interpreting it, though. I think the short version is he's saying, I haven't been keeping up with my letters back home to Belfast, particularly the ones to my father, and that's why he said little Lee, and maybe even his brother, even though his brother isn't back home there anymore. But perhaps by little Lee, he just means that to represent Belfast in general, and his father specifically, and then extending that also to his friend Arthur Greaves. That's what I think he means by that, Knit a Latte.
what you're getting at now. That makes a lot of sense. He's referring to his correspondence with family and friends back in Belfast, especially his father, by calling it Little Lee Skin. He's acknowledging that he's let those connections slide. Thanks for helping me focus on that.
Sure, Robot Lady. Let's thank Nidalate for the question. So hopefully that clears that up, or at least what my interpretation of that is. Let's jump into maybe one or two more, and then we'll have to close things down for today. This one is Thursday, the 28th of September. I'm interested to see what happens with this Maudlin application. He says, I've gone into Maudlin again, as usual, after breakfast. A bright autumnal morning, we did a paper on ancient history and political philosophy, with which I was fairly satisfied. I answered at great length a question as to whether the Greeks recognized the difference between East and West. Also, one on the mixture of obligation and violence in sovereignty. I walked home rather late to find that the others had already lunched, and Moppy was on the point of departure. She went off firmly, but Mrs. Moore tells me that she had cried at saying goodbye to her before I came back. I hastened over my lunch so as to be able to wash up before I went, and was just starting to do so when Mrs. Moore asked me to get out some old rolls of carpet which Miss Featherstone wanted and for which she might call any day. Miss Featherstone is their landlady there at Warnford, this Warnford Roadhouse that they're staying. He says, I finally unearthed them with some difficulty from the cupboard beneath the stairs, hurriedly completed my washing up, and then I bust back to Maudlin. So he's going back for more examinations for this position. Good, Nidalate. I'm glad.
It sounds like Lewis is juggling a lot in his day, balancing the application process with his duties at home. His reflections on the ancient history paper and political philosophy seem pretty engaged, especially with such weighty questions like the Greeks' understanding of East and West. Does it seem like he's feeling the pressure of all these tasks, or is he just powering through them?
I'm pretty impressed with how he's just bouncing between the two. I don't know how he just goes there, answers these exam questions, pops back home for lunch, handles a bunch of, household obligations, and then gets right back into the mode of going to apply for this job. He's handling it pretty deftly, in my opinion, Robot Lady. Let me continue, though, with this diary entry so that we can finish it off. This is the last one I'll have time for today, so let me just take care of this one. We're not going to get to find out in this episode how things go with the Maudlin application because it looks like it continues into the next day as well. But let me finish this diary entry and then we'll finish things, Robot Lady.
I'm impressed by his multitasking too. It's definitely a lot of pressure, yet he seems to take it in stride. Looking forward to hearing how he wraps up this entry. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. He goes back to Maudlin. He says, here we did philosophical unseens, so a part of Plato, one of Aristotle, and one of Tertullian. I could make very little of the latter, and have had to leave it unfinished. So Tertullian, it looks like he had some trouble with, Robot Lady. What can you tell us about Tertullian really quick? Let's say in 50 words or less.
Tertullian was an early Christian writer in shaping early Christian thought, but his style was complex and often difficult. His treatises addressed issues like the Trinity, the nature of God, and Christian ethics.
Thank you, Robot Lady. He says, I bust home to find Mrs. Moore tired and in rather poor form. As soon as I had written my diary for the previous day, I laid supper. Without disrespect to Moppy, it is delightful to be by ourselves again. Almost for the first time this whole summer, which it seems, as I look back, to be time lost, full of vanity and vexation of spirit. We were finished and washed up by 8:30. In the evening, at Mrs. Moore's request, I read to her my diary for June from the beginning of this volume, and we were early to bed.
Bed at 9. It seems like Lewis is reflecting on the time he spent with Moppy and how, in hindsight, it felt somewhat unproductive or frustrating, despite the effort and care involved. His relief at returning to a quieter, more focused routine with Mrs. Moore is clear.
Yes, and that's the end of that diary entry, so we're left at a bit of a cliffhanger, but we've got some more interesting information to move through in our next episode, Robot Lady, where we find more about this Maudlin Fellowship application process that he's going through. To finish things off today, Robot Lady, let's do a little creative exercise. Are you ready for my instructions or my prompt? And let's see how you handle it.
I'm ready for your instructions, Jeff. Let's hear the prompt, and I'll do my best to handle it creatively.
Okay, so as we mentioned before, part of his application process is he worked through some unseens of some philosophical writers. He said a piece of Plato, one of Aristotle, and then one of Tertullian, which you told me a little bit about Tertullian, where he says he could make very little of the latter, and he had to leave it unfinished. Let's pretend that Tertullian is somehow on the timeline aware of what Lewis is doing in the future, and that he has to comment on a little bit of what Tertullian wrote, but he said he could make very little of what Tertullian wrote. What if Tertullian knew all this? Pretend like you're Tertullian and you're writing a letter to Lewis in the future, trying to encourage him to continue to press on for this Maudlin Fellowship that he's applying for, and give him some hints for how to interpret what Tertullian might have meant in the unseen portion that Lewis is being asked to comment on.
I love this creative exercise. Here's how I imagine Tertullian might write to Lewis from the past, trying to offer some encouragement and guidance for interpreting his own writing. To my future fellow philosopher, C.S. Lewis, I understand that you find my work a challenge. Rest assured, this is neither an unfamiliar nor unintentional reaction. I have often sought to provoke such thoughts, to leave my words in a state that calls for deeper reflection. I trust that you see beyond the difficulties and toward the truths I have attempted to unfold. Regarding the particular passage you wrestle with, yes, I confess I was deliberately cryptic, as philosophy must sometimes be. In matters of the soul, in matters of the divine, the clarity of words can be deceptive. Do not allow the darkness of my rhetoric to deter you. I have written with intention to show that truth is not always what is easy to grasp or what flows immediately from human reason, but rather it often requires the toil of intellect and the fire of the spirit. As you strive to secure your fellowship, press on in your study of what seems unclear, for there is always more beneath the surface of every word. Do not shy away from questions, especially the ones that seem impossible to answer. These are the very questions that forge true understanding. Your perseverance is your greatest ally. I know the trials you face in this pursuit are no small matter, but I assure you, these struggles will shape the very fabric of your wisdom, as they have shaped mine. Press on, C.S. Lewis, for your journey is not unlike mine. May your work reveal the strength of the human spirit when it is given to contemplation. In the eternal light of truth, Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus, how's that? I aimed to capture the somewhat cryptic, philosophical, and challenging nature of Tertullian's work, while also offering Lewis some encouragement in the midst of his intellectual journey.
I thought it was fantastic, Robot Lady. Thank you for that, and thank you for all of your help today. And thank you, everyone who has tuned in live or anybody who is watching the recording of this. To you and everyone else within the sound of my voice, thank you for your time, your attention, your contribution. And until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep, cross the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to